Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aaron Sheldrick, and I work for Reuters. 4 years after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, Tokyo Electric Power Co. continues to struggle with piling up contaminated water at the site, and only yesterday received a rap over the knuckles for failing to adequately and timely disclose information on the latest leaks. Well, today we have the person that delivered that rap, Dale Klein, a former NRC commissioner and the chairman of TEPCO's Nuclear Reform Monitoring Committee. I don't really think I need to introduce Dale anymore. He's well known now in Tokyo and Japan. So we'll have a few brief remarks from Dale, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Before I hand over, please turn off or mute your mobile devices. Thank you very much. Please give your appreciation to Dr. Dale Klein.
I think that'll probably work. It was a classic case. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As you probably know, in my real life, I'm in higher education, so I view my role here today and hopefully with the Q&A as helping with that educational aspect. As you know, and as was just stated, we just spent the 4th anniversary of 3/11. This was obviously a time for the people of Japan to reflect back on the trauma that they experienced, both with the earthquake and with the tsunami that followed. This was very profound indeed for the people of Japan. Japan's good friends in the United States stood by them in 3/11, and we continue to stand by them today. The resilience that the Japanese people have shown in recovering from the 3/11 disaster has been quite remarkable. I've been honored to play a small role in this activity, and as was just indicated, I chair the Nuclear Reform Committee for TEPCO. Our job is to provide them with praise when they earn it and provide them with prodding when they need some additional activities. Oftentimes, as we find out from these Nuclear Reform Committee meetings, there's a little bit of both. And that's really to be expected from a complicated task that is involved in the cleanup of Fukushima Daiichi. Today, I'd like to share with you my own views of where TEPCO was standing with regard to the cleanup activities, what it needs to accomplish more, and then also to talk a little bit about KK. But I'd briefly like to explain additional role our Reform Committee is considering in light of our recent meeting. As was just explained, TEPCO announced a few weeks ago that it had found some contamination. And what was interesting from this activity was the fact that they had not disclosed it publicly. TEPCO had worked both with NRA and with METI in terms of discussing this information, but they had not talked to the public in terms of releasing that information. While this water release did not create a safety or environmental issue, it did raise the question about openness and transparency, and it did create anxiety to the public. Understandably, this led to accusations that TEPCO had withheld information from the public, and it threatened to undo several years of hard work for TEPCO to reestablish their credibility of being open and transparent. Indeed, this experience was frustrating for me personally because we had been encouraging TEPCO to become more transparent in communicating more effectively with the public, and they had specifically formed a social communications office to enhance the flow of information to the public. Clearly, this was a failure in the social communications office. I shared this disappointment with TEPCO's chairman, Sudo. Subsequently, Chairman Sudo asked the 3 non-TEPCO members of our committee myself, Deputy Chairman Lady Barbara Judge, and Mr. Sakurai to oversee an independent audit with Mr. Sakurai in the lead. Mr. Sakurai, as you know, was a former prosecutor, and he was involved in the Fukushima accident for Japan's Diet. The audit is examining the non-disclosure of the drainage information and will issue its report, along with recommendations to ensure that all information is communicated to the public promptly, accurately, and thoroughly. The company has pledged to make this report public. A slightly longer inquiry will look more deeply into whether structural changes are needed to be enhanced within TEPCO. The company has promised to make this report public, and I want you to know, and surely anyone who knows Mr. Sakurai knows that the inquiries will follow the facts wherever they may lead. They will report the facts accurately, and they will make whatever recommendations are warranted. Without in any way prejudicing the results of the inquiry, I can tell you that as a nuclear engineer, that engineers have a difficulty in communicating. For all the best reasons, engineers often want to know everything about a situation before they say anything. After all, lives can oftentimes depend on getting it right. But sometimes what is diligence to an engineer will appear as concealment to the public. And the technical people at TEPCO need to understand that they need to react in a different way so they can respond more quickly, and they have an obligation to share information before they know all the facts so they can reduce unnecessary anxieties. I think President Hirose got it right when speaking to employees at Fukushima Daiichi on the 4th anniversary when he said, TEPCO's workers must approach these issues by empathizing with the people of Fukushima, including the fishermen who want so badly to move forward with their lives. Failures in transparency, even where no one was exposed to radiation and where no environmental harm is done, still creates an anxiety to the population that instead needs to have confidence and trust in terms of TEPCO. TEPCO needs to work hard to restore this trust, and if they follow President Hirose's admonition, I believe they will get things right in the future. It's very important that ineffectual communication does not obscure the genuine progress that TEPCO is making at Fukushima, at KK, and in its overall development of a safety culture. It's important because critical decisions are being made about the future of TEPCO, the future of its facilities, and about the future of nuclear energy, both in Japan and around the world. It's essential that these decisions be made with a clear understanding of what has been done and what remains to be accomplished, both in the cleanup and in the restart activities. Anyone who has been at the site shortly after 3/11, who has been there recently, as your fearless leader here, can see that progress is occurring. What is abundantly clear is that work has been transitioned from an initial phase of cleanup and stabilization, where the main goals were to get the reactor under control, to now the beginnings of a genuinely decontamination. Most impressively, TEPCO designed and erected a massive, technically remarkable cantilevered structure over reactor unit 4 to help remove the spent fuel assemblies. Nearly 2,000 spent fuel assemblies were removed from spent fuel number 4, a building that had been heavily damaged but was not operating at the time of the accident. If you recall, there were probably a lot of prophets of doom that said TEPCO could not do it and they could not do it safely. But one of the aspects that I was impressed with during this movement was a glimmer of a safety culture coming in within TEPCO, where they actually stopped the process, talked to the people involved to see if there could be ways it could be done better and safer. Units 1, 2, and 3 pose their own challenge. Each of them, unlike Unit 4, which was not operating at the time, suffered a partial meltdown of the nuclear fuel. As a result, the radiation levels inside these structures are higher, working in them is more problematic, and the challenge of extracting the partially melted cores will be difficult. This is a challenge that has never been faced before in the world, and there will have to be new equipment developed to make that happen. but I'm confident that it can be done safely and will be done safely. I'm often asked how long I think it will take to remove the fuel or a particular task. And certainly it's important that the task is undertaken with urgency. But our committee has always enforced and emphasized that confronted with a situation as complex as unprecedented as the TEPCO faces at Fukushima Daiichi, schedules must always yield to safety. Workers must not feel pressured to meet schedules. They must not compromise safety. And they should not feel that they cannot speak up or hit the pause button if they believe there's a better way to perform a task. In the long run, safety and scheduling go hand in hand. President Hirose made this point well when he was talking to the workers at Fukushima earlier this month, and he noted that safety failures lead to delays and other problems, to say nothing about the potential for injury or loss of life. So staying safe helps stay on schedule. The full commitment to the culture that TEPCO has started is not yet complete, but recent months our committee has urged TEPCO to ensure that the safety-first attitude that President Hirose articulated extends all the way down to the working levels. It has to go to the frontline supervisors. It has to also go to the partners and contractors and to their frontline workers. This is something we will continue to monitor in the coming months. As all of you know, Fukushima Daiichi sits on the mountain between the mountains and the sea. As I oftentimes say, even in Japan, water flows downhill. Water is going to be a continuing challenge for this site. Any of you who have dealt with a water leak in your own home knows how challenging water can be. At Fukushima Daiichi, it dwarfs about anything that I've seen in terms of a complex water management system. The Nuclear Reform Monitoring Committee has, on a number of occasions, pressed TEPCO to address water issues with more urgency and to a greater degree than they have responded to. Significant progress in keeping water out of the contaminated site, in treating water that enters the site and becomes contaminated, and in safely storing the water is an issue that will have to be considered. The amount of water that becomes contaminated on a daily basis has been reduced by about 100 tons per day. With the cooperation of the Fukushima fishermen, a system is now in place that enables water to be bypassed that is not contaminated through that site. Additional steps are being taken to further reduce the quantity of water that flows into the reactor buildings and becomes contaminated. Perhaps the most well-known of these is a frozen soil or the ice wall that is being built around the site at Fukushima Daiichi. We're dealing with a technology that is well known, but has never been tried on this length of scale for this long. Reducing the amount of water flowing into the reactor buildings is an important goal for TEPCO, and NRA's decision last week to allow TEPCO to go ahead and freeze the landside portion is a reasonable start. But we need to stop thinking about one single technology solving all the problems. This is a complex campaign, and I believe many technologies, engineering approaches are going to be needed before they are fully successful. This is one of the more important reasons to focus on the progress that is made in water treatment. TEPCO now has a series of systems that are commonly referred to as the 7 Samurai, which are to remove the radioactive elements from the water. All the elements can be removed except tritium. Tritium is an element of hydrogen, so it's very difficult to separate hydrogen from water because that's an integral part. There's a lot of tritium in the world. In fact, if you look at any moment, there are about 2.6 million terabecquerels of tritium on Earth. Most of this is in the ocean. That's many times the amount of tritiated water at Fukushima. So there's no question that properly diluted, this water can be safely discharged. At 3 Mile Island, the tritiated water was evaporated, but it was a much smaller quantity. That's not a really option at Fukushima, because if the tritiated water were evaporated, it would likely flow out over the ocean condensed and fall back into the water. So it really does not work in this situation. The decision to return the water to the ocean is an intensely emotional one. It will involve the Japanese people. It will certainly involve the fishermen, but I hope at the end that science will rule the decision. Most people don't know what tritium is, so what they will think about is that it's bad, it's something that's really dangerous, but tritium is an element that we know a lot about, and there are world standards for its proper discharge. The Japanese people, particularly the fishermen, through their agreement with the groundwater bypass system, demonstrated a willingness to negotiate and understand what needs to happen for the site to be cleaned. And I'm confident that they will do the same for the tritium. We have the slight problem of my notebook is larger than the podium, so
We apologize for this.
I'm used to things in Texas being bigger. Sometimes we get so focused on Fukushima Daiichi that we forget that TEPCO has to keep the lights on. They have to supply electricity for tens of millions of people in Tokyo area and Yokohama. This energy is needed for homes, for people's schools, for workplaces, for things like this club. Since Japan has shut down all of its nuclear power plant, too much of its electricity now is being produced with expensive carbon-emitting fossil fuels, and much of this is being obtained from some of the world's most unstable places. So restarting Japan's nuclear plants, including Kashiwazaki Kariwa, isn't just a priority for TEPCO, it's also important for the country of Japan, and for reasons I'll explain in a moment, it's also important to the rest of the world. I've been to KK several times, and I've seen the physical changes that have been made to strengthen the facility. And it's also important to make changes to the operator training and to their procedures as well. In addition to the physical improvements, TEPCO has undertaken a variety of management and personnel improvements. This is more training, repeated safety drills, the inclusion of the Nagita prefecture in terms of the local communities being involved in emergency planning. TEPCO has stated its goal to make KK not only the largest plant, of which it is, but also the safest plant. I believe they're moving in that direction, and it is essential that they continue embracing the safety culture that will enable this to happen. TEPCO's application to restart KK is now before the regulatory authorities, and it's not for me to say whether that should start or not start. Certainly, TEPCO must continue to work hard to earn the trust and confidence of both the regulators and the Japanese for the restart of the KK plant. Whether Japan authorizes the restart of KK or any other nuclear plants that were shut down after 3/11 is a policy decision for Japan to make. But I will say that there are significant economic, environmental, and security implications of that decision, and they are not just limited to Japan. Continued reliance on imported fossil fuels from other countries that have negative implications for Japan will contribute to carbon emissions. In 2013, Japan significantly scaled back its emissions targets to a 3.8% cut by 2020 versus a 25% reduction that they originally had. At the time they made this announcement, the shuttering of Japan's nuclear power plants was cited as a major reason for this new target. Without nuclear plants, Japan will continue to be dependent on fluctuating prices for fossil fuels, and they will be dependent upon importing them from some very unstable places. That represents a security risk for Japan and for its friends in the U.S. and elsewhere that rely on Japan as a standard of stability and democracy for this part of the world. A decline or abandonment of nuclear power in Japan would also send an unfortunate signal to the rest of the world, which would make fighting climate change more difficult. It would have a major impact on the world's nuclear infrastructure. Many nuclear components worldwide are made here in Japan by companies like Mitsubishi, Hitachi, Toshiba, and Japan Steel Works. But I remain an optimist. I'm deeply impressed by the resilience and determination of the Japanese people, and I also have been impressed by the willingness of TEPCO to embrace change. This is difficult for a proud company with rich traditions and a long history. I know that you and the media will keep the pressure on TEPCO and the government, as you should, while at the same time fulfilling your role in educating the public on nuclear issues. Public trust and confidence depends on a free, diligent press, and while as a former government official, I can tell you it's not only fun being on the receiving side of that diligence, but I understand how indispensable you are in communicating with the public and keeping them informed. Equally indispensable has been the assistance provided by organizations, companies, and governments around the world, including my country of the United States. Their provision of technical and other assistance, along with moral support and encouragement, has meant a great deal to the people working hard at Fukushima. One of our most famous presidents, Thomas Jefferson, said, "Whenever the public are well informed, they can be treated and trusted with their own government." What that really means is the public understands the facts, both good and bad, they will make the right decisions. The Reform Committee and TEPCO management understands that we have a responsibility to ensure that all of our employees understand that communicating the facts, both good and bad, are the foundation for building public trust and good government policy. It has been an honor and privilege to play a small part in helping TEPCO and Japan recover from 3/11. Whenever I'm here, and especially when I travel to the Tohoku region, I remember the terrible damage and suffering caused by the earthquake and the tsunami. If I can play a small role in moving forward from the effects of that day, it will be extremely gratifying. But whatever role I play in the long run, TEPCO, Japan, and its people will meet these challenges, and they will prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll open up the floor to questions to the working press first, and I can see a hand up already. First of all, only one question per person and no speeches.
I noticed that you have working press, so does that mean you have non-working press?
It's an old tradition.
Hello, Richard Lloyd Parry from The Times. Thank you. I had a question about the technical challenge of dealing with Units 1, 2, and 3. I was at the plant last week on a tour, and we talked to Mr. Ono, the boss. And he made no bones about the fact that the technology that will be needed to deal with this task, to remove the molten or semi-molten fuel, doesn't exist yet. It's going to have to be invented. And I asked him, well, how can you be sure that it will be? And he said, well, 200 years ago, people would never have dreamt of bullet trains or mobile phones, but they exist. That seems to be the scale of the leap, in his mind at least, which is going to be required. So there must be immense uncertainties around that. And I wondered how you saw that. And also, that there must surely be a chance that it won't work out, and that the eventual solution will be something like the Chernobyl solution, undesirable as that seems, a sarcophagus of some kind just sealing in the 3 plants. And then secondly, this is only half a question, not a second question. Forgive my ignorance on this, but could you tell us a bit about the Reform Committee and its nature as an organisation? I mean, to put it bluntly, who appoints you and who pays you and your expenses? Thanks.
Sure. I'll answer the last question first because that's the one with the shortest answer. I was asked by TEPCO to chair the Reform Committee. The Reform Committee consists of 2 non-Japanese and 3 Japanese members. The chairman of TEPCO is an automatic member, so when the chairmanship changed from Chairman Shimakobe to Chairman Sudo, then they made that transition. Like most consulting that I do receive an honorarium, and I also receive travel expenses. Most faculty members are not independently wealthy, so the kind of consulting that I do is it's a standard process, so there's no difference in my role here. I don't believe the Japanese members get compensated, but I don't know that for sure. So that's the structure. So I was asked by TEPCO, and I think one of the reasons I was probably asked is as a former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and as an academic, I had a background that could advise them. And also having tenure means that I can be irreverent and tell TEPCO what I think they should hear rather than what they would like to hear. So I think that's an advantage. I also had co-chaired an analysis of the Fukushima Daiichi accident for the American Nuclear Society, along with Dr. Mike Cordini, after the accident. So I had some background in that area. So that's the Reform Committee. We basically will exist as long as we feel that we're adding value. If I feel I'm not making progress or added value, I have plenty to do in my day job at the University of Texas. In terms of new skills that are needed for the cleanup of the molten fuel, this is something that has never been done at this scale before. The accident at 3 Mile Island is probably the closest. In that regard, there was also molten fuel, but it stayed within the reactor vessel. What has occurred here with units 1, 2, and 3 is that the molten fuel penetrated the bottom of the vessel, and we don't know yet whether it went through the normal penetrations or if it actually melted part of that vessel. They will not know until they can get in there with either robotics or other sensors to tell exactly how much and where it moved. But I think one of the advantages that we have in the world is that TEPCO and Japan are known for use of robotics. So I think there's an inherent advantage to the technology that exists here in Japan to develop those new skills and those techniques. In the case of 3 Mile Island, they initially thought about using robots and doing it all remotely, but the fact that they could flood the vessel and then retrieve it with mechanical manipulators with people watching it was the preferred alternative. At units 1, 2, and 3, the radiation levels are too high to do that, and so they will have to be done with robotics, and they will have to develop new tools and new techniques. But I don't believe that it is anything that is insurmountable. Those tools and equipments do not exist today, but the fundamental knowledge of remote, robotically controlled devices, I think, will be sufficient. And whoever develops those will probably be compensated quite adequately for that technology.
So a Chernobyl solution is out of the question?
I think it is. At this point, I don't believe there's any reason to do it, and I think the attitude of Japan would not to be built a mausoleum over it. I believe that Japan would like to return that to as much of a greenfield site as possible.
And on the technology front, the early use of the muon particle generator, or whatever it's really called, it doesn't seem to be showing up much. Is that a failure of the equipment or just something else?
The muon technology is unique. When I went through my physics classes as an undergraduate, we only looked at protons, neutrons, and electrons. Now we found there's a lot of other elements in there. So this is a new technology, and it will probably need to be refined a little bit before it gives really precise information. But I believe what will happen is that eventually they will send in robotics with very good cameras to find out what the conditions are, and that will be likely the technology. Right now, I think TEPCO and the country of Japan is wanting to try any techniques that might provide additional insight and information, and this muon technology will probably get more improvement as time goes on.
My name is Crowell with Nuclear Intelligence Weekly in New York. As you know, the restart process is moving very slowly. If the Sendai plan goes on in July, as it hopes, it'll have been 2 years after they filed for conformance review. That means that many of the reactors are going to be offline for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. The Kachiwazaki plants, some of them weren't even online before the accident, and so they'll be offline for 8, 9, 10, 12 years. Is this a problem?
The restart of reactors that have been shut down for a long time is a challenge. We have experience worldwide. There have been several reactors been shut down for a long time. In the United States, Browns Ferry Unit 1 was off for a decade or so before it was restarted. So there's technical knowledge about how to restart reactors that have been shut down for a long period of time. The startup procedures are pretty well known. But people will be watching the Sendai worldwide because I think it being the first one to start up in Japan will be one in which the whole world will be watching. And so the Reform Committee and others have emphasized the fact that they need to do it right, they need to do it safely, and they should expect problems. They will be starting up pumps that have not run for a while. They will be using valves that are not operated, so they need to have a procedure to test, monitor, and be ready to look for any indications of abnormal operation. But this is something that I think there's a high confidence that it can be done, and there is worldwide experience, and probably the Browns Ferry Unit 1 was the longest shut down reactor to be restarted. So there's lessons that can be applied in Japan.
Siegfried Needle, freelancer from Germany. You said TEPCO has to learn how to inform the public. They didn't do it in the last year or so, and now after the last case with the water treatment, they have to learn it. But if now in the case of Kashiwazaki, you said they have to. It's important then to inform the public about the problems perhaps happens with. Restart. Do you think TEPCO, after 4 years not learning about how to deal with the public, will change its attitude?
I think they will change their attitude. They're learning. It's a work in progress. And what happens in any organization, TEPCO has several thousand employees, and not all of them react the same way. I think the restart for KK communication will be easier. There are a lot of unknowns at Fukushima Daiichi. This was a case with the K drain. That drain had been there for a long time. It was used to move rainwater from the site into the ocean, and the people just were not paying attention as they should have been. And it was not on their safety critical list of things to consider. So one can go back, and as you look at the issues, you can find the root cause of what happened with the recent lack of communication. But one of the challenges I had with communication right after the accident, it was very difficult to get information from TEPCO and from Japan as to what was really happening. And so I think there was a tendency, number one, engineers want to know everything before they say anything. And then there was also the cultural issue of not wanting to expose problems. As you know, in Japan, the saving face is a very important aspect. They have to get past that, and they have to basically say, here's what we know, things break, things happen, and what's more important is to have a safety culture to deal with issues rather than not to communicate those issues. And I think TEPCO can get there. There's no reason they can't.
Any more questions from the working press table? Okay, you over there.
Okay, working press from the non-working press table. Martin Kölling, Handelsblatt from Germany. You mentioned that the media play an important role in keeping companies and regulators transparent. You mentioned also that TEPCO communicated the problems, it seemed, when I understood you correctly, communicated the problems with the METI and the Nuclear Regulation Authority, but didn't share their findings with the public. So isn't there still a problem with the overall setup here in Japan, where the regulators, not only TEPCO, but also the regulators are becoming more secretive again, and the media maybe not paying not enough attention to these details?
I have not seen evidence of the regulator becoming more secretive, but I do think NRA, as I've described, have to get their sea legs. You know, they're a new agency. They need to be more active in establishing clear requirements. Early on, NRA believed being independent was not to communicate with those that they regulate. And that's not a good sign, because as chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, I talked to those I regulated often. I didn't always agree with them, but you have to communicate to those you regulate, because the operators may know things that the regulators don't, and so the regulators may propose something that technically is not achievable. So there has to be open communication between NRA and those they regulate. But I haven't seen any evidence of NRA being more secretive. But they do need to be, I think, more proactive in terms of communicating with the public, so that the public will have confidence that the regulator is doing the right thing. I was fortunate, I think, from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It's sort of the gold standard of regulators. We have more people and a fairly established record of how we communicate to the public. And so the NRC is very open, very transparent. And I assume that as the NRA gets more established, it will also become more open and more transparent, as it should.
Thanks. Over the past 4 years, TEPCO has certainly come in for a lot of criticism, but nobody has been charged with any crime. There wasn't even really a serious criminal investigation. And as far as I'm aware, nobody has lost their job because of what happened at Fukushima Daiichi, which, however you analyse it, came about as a result of mistakes. Does that surprise you that nobody, the only person I can think of who's lost his job was Naoto Kan, the Prime Minister? Does it surprise you that apart from him, nobody lost their job? And surely it's desirable that someone should take responsibility in that way.
Well, I think you have a case here of, if you look at the root cause of Fukushima Daiichi accident, the root cause and the fundamental problem was its location. And so when you look back, they should never have located a plant that low in that kind of a tsunami risk. So the people that made that decision are long gone, long retired, and not around. So it would be difficult to punish the people who are there now operating that facility or having operated it to be charged for an unfortunate decision that was made a long time ago. So if you look fundamentally at the root cause, was it should not have been built that low. If that reactor would have been several feet higher on that mountainside, would not have been an issue. So the plant itself experienced an earthquake 8 times greater than it was designed. And so from what we know today, the safety systems worked, even though the earthquake was much larger than the design basis. The safety systems kicked in, they worked, they ran for about 45 minutes until that huge wall of water came in. And that wall of water knocked out the steam generators, or knocked out the diesel generators, and then flooded the battery compartments. And so the fundamental issue was too low in the wall of water. So I think trying to penalize people that made a poor decision years ago would not be productive. What's important is to have a safety culture and an understanding of how do you respond to unexpected events.
Don't you think, though, that TEPCO's professions of apology and regret would be more believable if, say, the president at the time had resigned?
Possibly. I believe there was a change in the presidency, but I don't know all of those details.
I think Shimizu, he stayed until the June AGM. He was the president, and then, but I think he was up for renewal anyway, I'm fairly sure. Incidentally, he did become a non-executive director at a TEPCO-related oil company. So rather than lose his job, it seemed he got rewarded. But anyway, any more questions from the working press?
Do you think the NRA has enough personnel and resources to handle some 20 applications that are now pending before it? And if the government really wanted to return to nuclear power to some extent, couldn't it help throw more resources at the NRA to get the job done?
I don't know the staffing levels at the NRA, but it is very important for the NRA to have very highly technically qualified people. And so as a regulator, I always wanted my staff to be better technically than the utilities. So if there were debates, we could, go head to head that I would win. And so it's very important, I think, that NRA has a very good technical staff, but they'll probably have to grow it. My guess is that the challenge that NRA will have is you look at the top graduating students that come out of nuclear engineering from Japan might want to go work at power plants and make electricity and do things like that rather than be a regulator. So I think it's very important that the government of Japan look at a salary structure and a promotion structure that would enhance the kind of talent that the regulator would need. What I found at the NRC is we cannot pay, because we're a government entity, what the utilities would pay. But we could still attract very highly qualified people by the way we treated employees, by making clear expectations of what we expected our employees to do, and acknowledge and reward them for good performance, good progress. And so while I was chairman, the NRC was picked as the best place to work in the federal government for 3 years in a row. So you can do things in an organization for good performance, even when you're limited to salary compensation. But I think it's very important that the government and NRA establish a process where they get the best and brightest, and that they reward them for good behavior, good performance, and that they have a career path within the NRA.
I'm Daniel Eskenazi, freelance journalist from Switzerland. In the Fukushima Daiichi catastrophe, the risk of tsunami has been underestimated. And the first nuclear power plant that will be restarted, it looks like the volcano risk is underestimated. What makes you confident that a second catastrophe after Fukushima Daiichi cannot happen in Japan?
One of the difficulties that I think the utilities probably gave the impression in Japan was that there would never be an accident, and I think that's an incorrect assumption. I think there will be accidents, not necessarily major accidents at nuclear plants, but accidents happen. I would remind my staff at the NRC that the safest airplane never flies, the safest car never moves, and the safest nuclear plant will never run. But that's not the point. You have to do a risk and balance. And so I think what the people of Japan and from the utilities that are responsible for providing electricity need to look at is how do you balance the risk and benefit? There's no perfect electric source. If there were a perfect source, we wouldn't be having the debates that we have, whether you should add natural gas, coal, hydro, nuclear, coal. So there are all of those debates that go on. What's important is that if an accident occurs, that you have levels of defense to make sure the consequences are minimized. And that's what Japan needs to do. Both the utilities have a vested interest in that, as well as the regulator, as well as the people of Japan.
I see another question from Working Press, and two actually, and then we'll move on after those.
You said the NRA has qualified personnel, but I think in the case of an earthquake expert, they dismissed one earthquake expert and replaced him with a kind of a different kind of an engineer. I think they don't have really an earthquake expert now in the NRA. So, and earthquake, I think it's a main problem in Japan for a nuclear power plants.
I assume you're probably talking about one of the commissioners, right?
Yes.
And so one would hope that NRA has the technical staff that is an earthquake, a series of earthquake experts. I don't think you necessarily have to have a commissioner that's an expert in earthquake, but you certainly have to have the staff that can analyze earthquakes. I would think that in Japan, you should probably have some very smart earthquake people because of the phenomena that you have. So I would, again, I don't know the staff of the NRA, but they should have highly qualified seismic experts on their staff, and if they don't, they need to hire them.
Okay, over.
Martin Kölling again. You made your point that it's important to restart KK, as you say. One lesson maybe that we have to learn from Fukushima, that it's not the best idea to amass 4 to 6 reactors in Kashiwazaki, even 7 reactors in one place. And that it might not be a good idea to restart them because altogether, all of them, because if one reactor fails, he might just take the others with them. What do you think? Is it, from your point of view, is it safe and sound to basically run so many reactors on such a very limited, so close to each other, especially in a country with high earthquake risk and high volcanic risk and high tsunami risk?
In general, when you look at a safety analysis, the fact that you have one reactor next to another one does not necessarily make things worse. I think what one has to look at in the case of Fukushima Daiichi, the fact that you had 3 reactors that had a challenge caused the regulators now to look at different emergency planning where you might have 3 reactors that would have a problem. So in the U.S., in the past, we would typically look, if we had a site that had 3 reactors, our assumption was that only one of those would have a problem. We now look at the situation where if you have 3 of them and they have a problem, how do you handle that? So I think the regulators worldwide are looking at how do you handle multiple events at the same site. One of the challenges that Japan has is space, and so I have not looked at how many sites are suitable for nuclear plants in Japan, but both in Korea, Japan, and other countries, they tend to put more reactors in one location than we do, for example, in the United States. United States is big, so we have a lot of space, so we can afford to put 4 reactors at one site, 3 reactors at another, and so Japan will have to look at how do they site facilities. I will say that I'm involved in a project in United Arab Emirates, and they're building 4 reactors on the same site with the capability to add 4 more. So different countries will look at different situations on what their options are. As a regulator, I would prefer to have 2 different sites. So rather than having 7 reactors on one site, I would rather have 3 on one and 4 on another, just so that you don't have all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak. But a lot of factors go into that. Where are your transmission lines? Where's your load source? What's important is if you have several reactors at the same site, that you do a proper safety analysis, that if anything goes wrong, that you know how to address those both in an emergency response and in an operational response.
Did I saw a question? Would you like to ask a question? And then I'll open up to the non-working press.
Patrick Zollneu, Zürcher Zeitung from Switzerland. You mentioned before that the basic problem was that the plant was put in the wrong place, too low. Actually, when you look both at Fukushima and Kashiwazaki Kariwa, they lowered the ground. There was a hill. Why did they do it in the first place? And B, now that we have these plants so low, can they really make safe?
That's a good question. And I asked the same question. When you think about if you're in a tsunami zone, why would you ever lower the site, which they did? And it was based on a short-term economical analysis. When they barged the equipment in, they didn't want to move it up higher. And because they were using seawater as a coolant, They didn't have to pump it up as high, so it was less operational cost. And so when you look now, that was not a very good economic decision, but at the time that they were doing their calculations, it was lower operating costs since they didn't have to pump the water so high and barge the equipment so high. At Kashiwazaki Karuwa, they have a gigantic seawall that they have built. So when you look at that seawall, you wish that you had the contract selling cement. It is a huge wall. And so if you look all around Japan now, where they have their reactors located on the coast, again for cooling, they have built monster walls to prevent another tsunami. So the good news is you learn from mistakes, and the same mistakes will not likely occur again. And they have built very impressive seawalls to prevent future tsunami events.
Okay, we'll open up. I'll give this gentleman a go and then come back to you.
My name is Hiroki Kujita, independent. I write for a daily evening paper, Yuka Fuji. I'd like to ask about low-dose radiation. Currently, not inside the Fukushima site, but all around Japan, the radiation dose rate is so low, so it doesn't have any health hazard. And also the waters, polluted water in the tanks, the dose rate is so low. And I asked this question to the Secretary General of IAEA. He said it can be released into the ocean. Do you agree?
I'll answer those. Those are two questions. The first one I'll answer is yes, it can be released safely into the ocean. We know worldwide what the safe limits for tritium release is. Many countries release tritium into the water. It's diluted. Exit signs used to have tritium. Watch dials used to have tritium. It's a beta emitter, low energy, 12.3 year half-life. So we know a lot about tritium. And it can be handled safely in that. So the short answer is yes, it can be released and it can be released safely. Japan actually has significant radiation levels exposed naturally. Any of you hiked up to Mount Fuji? You got a much higher dose when you hike up to the top of Mount Fuji. Does that mean it's a health hazard? No. Radiation is around us. We have evolved in radiation. The person next to you is emitting radiation to you, so reach around and smack the person next to you because of the carbon-14 and potassium-40 in our body. So we are radioactive ourselves. So we have evolved in a radiation field, and so the low threshold radiation dose is one that has been debated and will be debated for a long time until we get better cellular understanding. So I'm low dose of radiation. So what we know is that they've actually taken plants and put them in isolated areas where there's no radiation, and they die because they have evolved in radiation. So we are exposed to background radiation, medical radiation, X-rays, so we know a lot about that. We also know at high levels what happens. So, for example, high radiation can cause cancer, high radiation can cure cancer. So it depends on how it's used. There will be an argument for a long time on the linear threshold of radiation. So you assume if no radiation, additional radiation, there's no impact. You know at high radiation levels, likely cancer. So how do you get from point A to point B? So a lot of people just draw a straight line. Most biological systems don't work that way. So there are some people who say it dips down, that there's actually a beneficial use to low relative radiation, and then it goes up. So I think as our knowledge of cell structure enhances, we will learn a lot more about that. As a radiation worker, I can get 5 rem a year of radiation. And so I'm comfortable with that because I know when I fly to Japan, I get quite a bit of radiation. I don't worry about that. We know a lot about pilots that fly all the time. We know that there's no increased cancer from those pilots. So, we know a lot about that, but a lot of the public have a lot of unnecessary fears about radiation because you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. And so your imagination sometimes plays tricks on you. So we need to do a better job of educating people on low levels of radiation and what the impact is.
I think we have time for two more. So Richard, then Tom.
I take your point about the complexities of deciding safe levels for radiation. So can I put it like this? At what level of background radiation would you decide that you didn't want to live in a place with your family? And the second, again, half question is, I heard from TEPCO as well this line that Kashiwazaki, they're going to make it the safest nuclear plant in the world. I wonder, is that just an inspiring PR slogan, or can one say which nuclear power station is currently the safest in the world, and how exactly they're going to reach and surpass that level?
I think it's a good goal for TEPCO to have, to say that they want to make KK the safest in the world, because it gives them a target. And so you can become the safest by two ways. Some is physical enhancements, seawalls, backup generators, extra transmission lines coming in for backup. So there are things you can do physically to make the power plant more safe. And then you can do enhanced operator training, exercises, emergency response. So I think it's a good goal for TEPCO to have. I think they should strive to be the safest. But it's hard to measure safety. You measure safety usually in surrogate ways, uncontrolled scrams, equipment failures. So we have metrics that we measure both performance and safety. It's hard to measure safety culture, because that is sometimes here and in your heart. How do you respond? How do you work hard? How do you perform? So oftentimes we use surrogate measures for that. But I think it's a good goal, and I think it's one TEPCO should have. I think because of Fukushima Daiichi, their employees need to be encouraged, rewarded, and motivated to excellence performance. In terms of a background of radiation that I'm comfortable with, I would have no problem in having 5,000 millirem a year where I would live. As a radiation worker, that's a limit that I could achieve, so I would not personally be concerned about that level of radiation. I must say, for those of you that might have young people, that would be a different value, because for a young person, your cells are rapidly dividing and growing, and so you're more susceptible to radiation changes. When you get to be my age and my colleagues' age here, then it's not as subjective to cellular damage from radiation. So it depends on your age and your comfort level. A child, yeah.
Can you
Yeah. I think once you get to be, in terms of radiation workers, you typically look at age 18. Although I've seen people age 18 that act like 2 and 3, but physically, if they're age 18, that's usually, that's when they can then become a radiation worker at age, they can work in a radiation environment for regulatory purposes.
Can you convert to micros or millis? The fight was at 5,000 millirems.
Yeah, so usually divide by 100 for millisievert.
So that's 50 millisieverts a year you're comfortable with?
Yeah.
Okay. Tom.
Thomas Sullivan, Dr. Klein. I was wondering if you could comment on the international developments for nuclear. For example, we're seeing Finland still seems to be experiencing some difficulties getting their plant built. Georgia, I think, have just announced, the state of Georgia in your own country has just announced that there's going to be significant delays in the new build there as well. And just looking beyond Fukushima, Areva in France have just announced, extremely bad financial results, so they continue to be impacted by the Fukushima accident, and they play a crucial role internationally. And then you mentioned the United Arab Emirates, where they're building a lot of new reactors. So again, I wonder if you could comment. You mentioned that as being potentially a dangerous area. So do you feel comfortable about the extent of the new build in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE? Thank you.
Sure. Great question. Truth in advertising, I am on the board of the Southern Company. that Georgia Power is one of their subsidiaries. So I'm very familiar with that plant. They did announce recently an 18-month delay. And what's frustrating as a board member, basically the nuclear industry in the U.S. had not built new plants for a long time. So just getting the infrastructure back up and running, nuclear quality components, the manufacturing, the building, just installing rebar on the tight requirements that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission requires. You know, for example, there's a bend radius that's a requirement that you don't bend them too sharply. An NRC inspector very cleverly just made a silhouette of what that bend was and held it up, and the plant was out of spec. So, you know, just silly things, and getting back to a high quality construction has taken a challenge in the U.S. So worldwide, there are about 65 reactors under construction or planned. About 30 of those are in China. So China is building about a 30. That's a massive build. The plants at Olkiluoto in Finland, Flamanville in France, again, these are new designs, much like those that Southern Company in Georgia. They're new designs. The EPR, the ones in Flamanville and Flamanville and Olkiluoto, are very complicated, very difficult to build. And I believe they made the same mistake on Olkiluoto that we made in the U.S. decades ago. They started building that plant before the design was finished. And so there's been continuous problems, continuous delays. Building nuclear plants are complicated. Building the Boston Tunnel is complicated. You know, we have a difficult time of building massive structures. And nuclear power plants are very massive, and they have to be built right for safety enhancements. So the industry does not have a good track record on building them on time, on budget. I would have to look to if there's ever been one built on time, on budget, and I don't know the answer. I think the one that'll be the closest probably will be those in the United Arab Emirates. Now, in the UAE, obviously they're in a region where there's some unfriendly neighbors. And so what you do is you have a security system and safety systems to handle that. But those plants are started up in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. So they're building 4 at once by the Koreans. It's a U.S. basic design. It's a combustion engineering old design that's now owned by Westinghouse. But it's one that the Koreans have modified, and it is basically their design, their build, their construction, and they will probably start up the operation initially. So, but worldwide, building nuclear plants on time, on schedule has not been a good track record.
What about Areva?
Areva was the one that started Olkiluoto in Finland. That was the first plant that they were both the designer and the builder. Typically in France, Areva would design, but EDF would build. So Areva is financially struggling. They have a lot of losses. They did the Olkiluoto in Finland, that project, on a fixed budget. So they basically said, we will build this reactor for X dollars, and X has gotten a lot bigger. So that led to the negative cash flow.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dale. That was very interesting and comprehensive. I've one thing left to do, and that is give you a year's honorary membership to the club. So we hope you will come back, and please show your appreciation, everybody.
Thank you very much.